Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the final day of the 2022 Integration Symposium here at Fuller Theological Seminary. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Brad Strawn, and I am the Evelyn and Frank Fried Chief of Spiritual Formation and Integration, Dean of the Chapel, and Chair of the Integration of Psychology and Theology here at Fuller. It's a pleasure to have been hosting these last 2 days and to hear from Dr. Emmons, notable faculty, Dr. Amos Young, Dr. Pamela Epstein-King, as well as our wonderful student respondents this week, Rebecca Bear and Hannah Che. A couple of things before we begin our final day. First, for those joining us looking for translated versions of this program, please watch this short video on how to select that function in Zoom.
오디오로 한국어 통역을 원하시면 여러분의 줌 화면에서 통역 버튼을 누르시고 한국어를 선택해 주십시오.
Si desea escuchar la traducción del audio al español, haga clic en Interpretación en la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom y seleccione Español.
I'd also like to extend a special welcome to any prospective students who are joining us today for the first time online. Remember, if you've purchased CE units, each 2-hour session is worth 2 units. Please note that your attendance on Zoom will be recorded and a completed evaluation will be required. Later today, a post-event survey will be sent out to all registrants. The evaluation form will be available to download on the last page of the survey, along with the instructions on how to submit it. Certificates will not be issued until an evaluation form is submitted via email to psychce@fuller.edu. If you're newly joining us today, the program will begin with a presentation from Dr. Emmons, with a response from a member of a Fuller faculty member, followed by a response from a current Fuller student. Then we will have a time of Q&A where you are invited to submit your questions on Zoom via the Q&A feature. I would now like to introduce Fuller's Chief Academic Officer and Professor of Psychology, Dr. Alexis Abernathy, to pray for us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strong. Well, welcome everyone who's been with us these 3 days. And for those who are joining today for the first time, welcome to you, a special welcome. We are so thankful to Dr. Strong, Dean Kosey, the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy, the events team, and everyone who's been working behind the scenes. Thank you. Dr. Emmons, we are so honored to have you as our Integration Symposium speaker. Your lectures on gratitude have been enlightening, thought-provoking, and inspiring. I deeply appreciate the presentation of your empirical research, your sharing spiritual, philosophical, and theological perspectives, as well as you sharing your own journey related to gratitude. That's been particularly powerful. Today, we look forward to your talk on new directions. The respondents have been excellent, and I've appreciated your engagement with them, and I'm looking forward to what will unfold today. I'm particularly interested in what gratitude looks like in the midst of suffering. And the conversation yesterday, as Hannah Che focused her response and the following discussion on some of these dimensions, was particularly meaningful to me. Recently, in the past few months, when we've had the rare opportunity to be in person in larger gatherings outside, I have experienced, as I've stood before people, a collective sense of the impact of the suffering that we've been through these past couple of years related to COVID, as well as the racial pandemic and all of the things that are associated with that. So I have found in these moments being in touch with that suffering, but also a sense of gratitude has emerged in that same moment, which is part of what you all were discussing yesterday, these things coming together. And the scripture that often comes up for me is from Psalm 118. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And even as we are together in this virtual space, I am grateful and thankful. A theologian that has really inspired me is scholar professor Howard Thurman, who was the first dean of the chapel at Howard University. He asked a question: what is the nature of your own gratitude? And he goes further to ask us, how many times have you said quietly in your own heart, thank you, life, for all of the graces that have come to me? Or thank you, God, because thou hast not dealt with me after my sins, nor according to my iniquity. You reminded us yesterday, Bob, that we need to think less about gratitude performance versus focusing on others, on God and being. I really appreciate that reminder. So as we pray now, may we live that out more fully, not only today, but in our lives. Let us pray. Dear Lord, just thank you so much for this opportunity to continue to learn and understand more about gratitude. We thank you for Dr. Emmons and all the ways that you have led him in his life to pursue this, his mentoring of so many students that have blessed us at Fuller in particular ways, and so many people across the country and in our world. We ask, Lord, that you continue to lead us and guide us and inspire us in this work, deepen our understanding so that we might live out gratitude in a more fully embodied way. We ask all these things in your Son, Jesus' name, amen. Back to you, Dr. Strong.
Thank you, Dr. Abernathy. Now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Emmons. Dr. Emmons is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of California, Davis, and Distinguished Visiting Scholar at Biola University. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of more than 250 original publications in peer-reviewed journals or chapters, and has written or edited 8 books, including Thanks, How Practicing Gratitude Can Make You Happier, Gratitude Works, a 21-day program for creating emotional prosperity, and The Little Book of Gratitude. A leader in the positive psychology movement, Dr. Emmons is founding editor and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Positive Psychology. His research focuses on the psychology of gratitude as it relates to human flourishing and well-being. His groundbreaking work on gratitude has been featured in dozens of popular media outlets, including the New York Times, USA Today, US News and World Report, Newsweek, Time, NPR, PBS, Consumer Reports, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and The Today Show. Following hearing from Dr. Emmons, we will hear from Dr. Wilmer Villacorta. Dr. Villacorta is Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies. Prior to coming to Fuller in 2009, Dr. Villacorta served on faculty at the Center of Discipleship and Mission in Alhambra, California, and the Missionary School of Emmanuel Bible Church in Peru, and the Latin American School of Missiology in Peru, where he also served as dean for 4 years. Dr. Villacorta and his wife, Jeannie, spent 4 years as directors of the missionary project, Bridges Project, in his native Peru, building, mentoring networks between North American college students and indigenous ministries, and teaching courses in leadership to church planters and pastors. Wilmer is the author of Unmasking the Male Soul, Power and Gender Trap for Women in Leadership, and Tug of War, The Downward Ascent of Power. His dissertation, Unmasking Machismo, From Malleability to Transformation of Andean Pentecostal Leaders in Central Peru, argued that working alongside women in leadership is highly important to the positive transformation of male leaders in today's church, specifically in the Latin American context. He is co-founder and co-chairman of the Network of Developing Latin Leaders and has translated several books into Spanish on the topics of theology of mission, leadership development, and mentoring. Dr. Villacorta, we're happy to have you with us today. Finally, we will hear from Fuller student, Bethany Ferguson. Bethany is a fourth-year PhD student who is studying and working in the area of trauma, spirituality, and culture. Bethany, we are also happy to have you. We're glad to have them all with us today, and we look forward to joining in a period of Q&A following their presentations. Remember, during those presentations, you can add your questions to the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also chat If you're chatting online, make sure you select everyone from the downward box so that everyone can see your comments. Before I turn this over to Dr. Emmons, I just have to say a couple of my own thank yous very quickly here. I want to thank everyone who's made this possible, who's been working behind the scenes, especially our event team. Big shout out to Chantel Gibbs, for her whole team, for Laura. Thank you to our translators. Thank you to Andrew and Reed making all of this work. Many of you know we planned to be in person, and because of COVID, we pivoted at the last minute. Here's to our last Fuller Integration Symposium online, or solely online. We'll always be online for all of you, but hopefully we'll be able to be also in person in the future. Again, a big thank you to the Fuller staff as well, Beth Smith, Tammy Anderson, everyone who's made that possible. I also want to let you know, again, if you're interested in hearing or seeing some of our past integration symposiums or integration resources, please go to fuller.edu/integration, and you can float around on that page and find past videos. You can find resources, you can find out how to contact us, and we'd love to do that. Before, again, I turn this over to Bob, there's 3 customs here at the Integration Symposium. One is I wear a different bow tie every day. Keep those bow ties coming, send them in. Secondly, we make sure we have amazing speakers, check on both of those. And the third is I take a moment to share a poem. Why a poem? Because I'm in charge and I get to. And secondly, because poetry sometimes captures something that's hard to capture in all our science, even in our theology, sometimes in our graphs. And so I usually choose a short poem to share right before the speaker that somehow attempts to grab in some particular way something from the theme of this symposium, which of course, as we know now, is about gratitude. So this poem I share with you today is written by Kaylin Hott and is called God Says Yes to Me. I asked God if it was okay to be melodramatic, and she said yes. I asked her if it was okay to be short, and she said, it sure is. I asked her if I could wear nail polish or not wear nail polish. And she said, honey, she calls me that sometimes. She said, you can do just exactly what you want to. Thanks, God, I said. And is it even okay if I don't paragraph my letters? Sweet cakes, God said. Who knows where she picked that up? What I'm telling you is yes, yes, yes. God Says Yes to Me by Kaylin Hott. Bob, thank you for being with us. I'm throwing it to you.
Well, thank you, Brad, so much for all you've done. I'm so grateful, and I know everyone is. And Alexis, thank you also for your wonderful comments, sharing with us this morning. So once again, good morning, everyone. Just a couple of things that I wanted to mention before we plunge into today's topic. First of all, I am deeply appreciative, yes, grateful for all of you that I've heard from. I've heard from a lot of you over the last couple of days after each morning's presentation. And I haven't had a chance yet to respond to all of you, but I will. So, the comments, the encouragement, the resources you've suggested to me, very, very valuable. And so I deeply appreciate hearing from you. So I will get back to you and thank you for that. I hope to hear from more of you. Especially after today, when I present what for me is some new ideas, kind of tentative, kind of speculative, and I'm very much interested in getting feedback either in the question and answer period or, afterward, because, and I think my email address, just send it. You can either send it to raemmons@ucdavis.edu or robertemmons42@gmail.com. They're the same account. They go to the same place. And so either way, I'll hear from you, and I would love to hear from you and just get some more ideas about what gratitude means to you, how you're able to incorporate gratitude and gratitude practices into your life and into your work, all of those sorts of things. Okay, we go to the slideshow now, my production team. This would be great. Okay, so I did want to also mention, the other thing I wanted to mention to you is to bring up some additional resources that I want to make, I can't say I want to make these available, I just want to make you aware of. So in case you want to go deeper into the science or the spirit or the practice of gratitude, from those I've heard from, I know a lot of you have been, trafficking in the area of gratitude yourselves for a long time. But there are some additional resources that could be useful at some point. Brad is very kind and has mentioned my own books, but I want to mention some other people's books that I found very meaningful and very illuminating. So the first one is entitled The Gratitude Factor, Enhancing Your Life Through Grateful Living. This is written by a good friend of mine, Charles Shelton. Charlie was a Jesuit priest, but also a psychologist at Regis University in Denver, Colorado for many, many years. I would say of all the people that I know who have been contributing to the scholarship on gratitude, I think he's the deepest thinker about gratitude, especially from a Jesuit perspective, being a Jesuit priest, as you would expect, focus a lot about spiritual exercises and Ignatius Loyola and that sort of thing, but he's also very up to date on the research and clinical work because he saw clients as well. Tragically, Charlie's life was cut short several years ago. I think it was about 3 or 4 years after this book came out. The book came out in 2010, and he died very unexpectedly. I think he had like a brain aneurysm, so it was tragic. He had so much more to contribute to teach us about gratitude. So I recommend this book very much. And of course, you can get all of these, in your usual places like Amazon or other online or in-person stores. The second, let's go to the third book. So Wake Up Grateful by Christy Nelson is an amazing book. And if any of you have any familiarity with any of these books, you go ahead and put a plug in the chat as well. I love this book. And Christy Nelson is the executive director of the Network for Grateful Living, which is the organization that was started by Brother David Steindl-Rast, who we mentioned yesterday. And Brother David is the worldwide expert on gratefulness and grateful living. And so this book came out about a year ago. And what's really remarkable about it is that because it's Christy had been through so much herself in terms of her own struggles and journeys and adversities and her battle with cancer that she recovered from. And she knows gratitude, deeply and broadly, as does Charlie. So I highly recommend this book, Wake Up Grateful. And then the book in the middle is a book of gratitude practices. It's entitled The Grateful Practice Workbook and Gratitude Journal. And there's 33 chapters, each one with multiple different activities, actionables, things you could easily build a curriculum on for small groups or large groups or just for any purpose whatsoever for those who want to go deeper and actually want to, build and develop the practice of gratitude in their lives. So it's a workbook and a journal. And so these are just 3 additional resources that I wanted to call to your attention. Okay, so today I want to focus your attention on, as I promised you yesterday, just some ideas I've been having. I want to talk about some new directions in the science and in the practice of gratitude and the application of gratitude. And one of those that I've been thinking a little bit about recently, not as much as a lot of people have, but I've just begun to think about what's the connection between gratitude and thinking about life from a grateful, perspective or through a lens of gratefulness, and its potential connection to, planetary well-being or planetary flourishing. I spent the last couple of days talking about gratitude and human flourishing from the perspective of happiness, well-being, thriving, as Pam mentioned yesterday. And I think it's really difficult for us to flourish individually or even collectively. If the planet is not flourishing, if the planet is languishing, how can we flourish, individually and collectively? So is it possible that somehow, some way, in some, small or perhaps even, large steps, that gratitude can make a difference for combating all the issues surrounding climate change? So that's what I want to focus your attention on today. But before I do that, just mention over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of applications of gratitude in different spheres or different domains of life. So, we had the science, the science of gratitude began roughly, as I mentioned the other day, 24, 25 years ago. A lot of good basic research had been conducted. And then we started to see emerge over the last decade applications and extensions of the science of gratitude in different settings, right? Research-based gratitude interventions in places like hospitals, for example. I mean, workplace settings in general, but especially it seems in hospitals and healthcare centers. And I mentioned this on Wednesday, the realization that gratitude is good medicine, that gratitude matters, both for patients as well as providers. And there's some really, really good research on the benefits of gratitude physically, physiologically, and in terms also of the mental health benefits. So that's been one area that's been quite active, and a lot of good research and implementing interventions within hospital settings. Another one has been within school settings, educational settings. So teaching gratitude is part of maybe social emotional learning, ways in which gratitude can be brought into various curricula, lessons plans, or even just, visual things like gratitude walls, which are common now in schools as well as in workplaces and hospitals. There's a place where people can write down things they're grateful for, and you have a nice visual aid there to help people just keep in front and center in their consciousness what it is and who they are grateful to. So it's very nice to see that within school settings. So that's been another one. So, and even in churches of all places, guess what? We see gratitude being implemented, or at least much more attention being given to. And if I actually found this online, I think this is in the UK, the Grateful Church, right? Which begs the question, what are other churches if they're not grateful? But anyway, it's kind of neat to see gratitude being applied in real world settings, whether they're workplaces, schools, churches, and so on. So I think that's just the natural trajectory of the evolution of the science of gratitude. Now that we know that it works, how can we implement this? How can we disseminate and translate the results of the research into places that really, really need it? One area, by the way, which has not received, actually, maybe I'll ask you this, since I know from yesterday you guys like to volunteer ideas. Can you think of a domain or sphere of life that you don't see much gratitude or hear much gratitude being brought to bear? We talked about workplaces and healthcare and education. Politics, boom, stop right there. That's what that was the first one that came to mind. So Gustavo, thank you. Garbage collection. Yes, we're grateful for the garbage collectors. Thank you, Pam. Marriage, relationship. Well, you see a little bit of it. Hopefully you see a lot of it in your own marriage. But yeah, counseling, paying our bills, finance. Oh, yeah, so economics. Yeah, gratitude, pets. Mortician services. Okay, I see we're kind of deteriorating here. It's kind of interesting perspectives. Family life, right? So there's many spheres of life. Obviously, you're not going to mention the environment because you know I'm going to talk about that. But politics is an interesting one, right? You don't hear much gratitude amongst politicians or gratitude for politicians or for our elected leaders. In fact, usually just the opposite. You don't hear many political candidates running on a platform of gratitude. We want to make America grateful again or something like that. You just don't hear that. That reminds me, some years ago, I was at an event and the special guest speaker of the night was Jeb Bush. And it was before he was running for president. So this was about 7 or 8 years ago. And there was a meet and greet. And I talked to him for just a minute. And I told him what I did. He said, send me your stuff. Like, send me some articles or some books on gratitude. He was really interested in it. And I thought, well, okay, he's going to run on a platform, of gratitude. So I sent him some stuff and he wrote a nice thank you note. Still have it on my wall because that's really cool, I thought, but never ran on that, didn't get elected. So maybe he should have, maybe there should be some more gratitude in politics. Anyway, thank you for those comments. Very good ideas, all of those. What about gratitude and the planet? Okay, planetary well-being. I go back to that first slide. How can we engage gratitude and perhaps some other what I call moral faculties besides gratitude? It's not the only one, but because that's the one that I've been focusing on, I'm going to focus on that today. We'll focus your attention on its connection to the environment or in the context of environmental health or planetary well-being, whichever term you happen to resonate with. let me tell you how I got started on this, by the way. I didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, let's look at gratitude and climate change. I had never really thought that much about, I know this sounds awful, climate change. I was like so many others that, it was just kind of on the back burner. I didn't feel a sense of urgency about it. I figured it was one of those things that other people are going to take care of it. What could I possibly do, as a professor or as an academic who, writes books and gives talks and spends his days, turning sentences around on the computer. I don't really have that much impact or power to do anything substantial. But then I was asked to give a talk up at Lake Tahoe. So UC Davis has like an extension campus up at the north shore of Lake Tahoe in Incline Village, very beautiful place. And I know a lot of you have undoubtedly been to Lake Tahoe. And I thought, well, one thing that I might want to talk about here is the connection between gratitude and the environment, because everyone is very environmentally conscious, especially at this program that was sponsoring me. And I didn't want to just give my usual presentation about gratitude and happiness and health, but I always tailor my talks, specifically to the needs and interests of the audience. And one of the questions that came up, I threw out to the audience, says, can you be grateful, to the environment? Does that even make any sense, right? The connection between gratitude and nature. I mean, think about how we've talked about gratitude over the past couple of days. There's a giver, there's a receiver, there's a benefit. The benefactor intends a benefit for you. What is nature intending us anything? Or are we just, experiencing some of the benefits just because we live in nature and rely on nature and are dependent on nature? So I started thinking about that. Does it even make sense, to posit gratitude to nature? Or is it something which is counterintuitive? And I'll try to unpack some of that with you in just a moment. But then also, second thing which got me thinking about gratitude in the environment, in natural context, was a movie scene from, I don't know if any of you have seen this movie, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Very interesting, Humphrey Bogart, 1920s in Mexico, where they're mining this mountain for gold. So background. So our younger son has been, he's in a junior in college now, 21, but for at least the last 10 years, very much interested in the West, the Western frontier, the Wild West, Old West, right? Every way you can, look at in terms of the history, the geography, the folklore, the culture. So frontiers just kind of inspire him. And so we watch a lot of, in fact, when he was applying to colleges, he would often write about this in his essays about the frontiers. He was asked, one of his essays, he was asked, if you taught a course in college, what would that course be? And I still remember he wrote about the frontier. He wanted to teach about the American frontier just because it really represents, the ability to overcome obstacles and to venture into dangerous, but, promising unknown places and spaces and that sort of thing. Anyway, so we watch a lot of Western films, a lot of Sergio Leone's films, especially. And one of those was The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Okay, so there's a point in the movie where this is John Huston, by the way, it was his movie. Okay, and there's an old prospector, actually played by John Huston's father, Walter Huston. He tells his partners before they leave the mountain, so they've gotten the gold out of the mountain, and he says they have to restore the mountain to its natural state. He says, we've wounded this mountain, and it's our duty to close her wounds. It's the least we can do to show our gratitude for all the wealth she's given us. Now, this is interesting because we would call this gratitude, which is directed to a mountain. Now, I said to you the other day that gratitude normally goes to agents, right? There's agents, whether they're other people or supernatural beings who are doing things for us, providing goods, benefits for us that we could not provide or do for ourselves. This is a mountain, right? A mountain is not an agent. Right? I think that's non-controversial, right? A mountain doesn't intend to do us a benefit. It doesn't make a decision. It doesn't have a desire to do good for us. It doesn't, sacrifice things for us. But he's saying, no, it gave us wealth, her wealth, right? So he's seeing gratitude as an appropriate response to the good that he has received. I thought, well, does this even make sense? Does this cohere logically? How you could be grateful? We could say, well, he's anthropomorphizing. He's seeing, human intention, behind a mountain and all that sort of thing. But I think there's a way we can explain this if we make a distinction between two types of gratitude. So here are some basic questions that I suggested that day when I gave that talk at Lake Tahoe to this audience. Can we feel gratitude to the environment, first of all? Does that even make sense in cases like the one by that gold prospector? Now, conversely, if we don't care about the environment, if we don't have gratitude toward the environment, does failure to care imply ingratitude? Does nature deserve our gratitude? And by the way, as you might expect, the people at Lake Tahoe, 100%, unanimity there that they were unanimous saying, yes, that gratitude is deserving in the case of nature, that we can feel gratitude to the environment, that failure to care does imply ingratitude, and so on. And they weren't so much interested in all the nuances of the philosophical distinctions between different types of gratitude, but I know you guys are, so I just want to mention that because I think that's a way out of this dilemma. So I don't think that agency is always necessarily required when it comes to receiving a benefit. The point about gratitude is that we have a good, we know that the good is there quite apart from anything we did to deserve it. Typically, there's a giver, there's agency, okay? But we recognize that it's unmerited or free, it's there, and we benefit from it in a variety of ways, as we certainly benefit from everything that the environment provides for us. So that's a good illustration where it might not be necessarily the case. And if we make a distinction between two types of gratitude, which philosophers have really been unpacking this and teasing this apart over the last several years, and I really appreciate their work here. Philosophers can be sticklers for conceptual exactness, and they do a really good job of saying there's at least two basic types of gratitude. There's gratitude to someone for something they've provided for us. And that's primarily what we've talked about the last couple of days, right? Whether that giver is another person or God or some other supernatural agent, we think of this type of gratitude on the left, right? So it's targeted, it's directed toward me or toward someone, and it comes from someone. It's triggered by a specific benefit or good that I've received. So we could say it's specific, it's focused, it's attached to a giver, it's personal, it's directed. It really represents a case of thankfulness, as Brother David makes that distinction between thankfulness and gratefulness, which is a broader concept. One of the best distinctions that's often made by the philosophers is between prepositional and propositional forms of gratitude. Prepositional is gratitude to, T-O, whereas propositional is gratitude for. So I can say I'm grateful to Brad, I'm grateful to you, for your faithfulness and listening to these lectures. We're grateful to someone for a benefit they provided for us, but we're grateful for something. We're grateful for the chance to talk about gratitude. We're grateful for the good weather we have in California, where some of you don't have such nice weather right now. We're grateful for technology. We're grateful for versus grateful to is different in a variety of specific ways. So it's non-targeted, it's more impersonal or transpersonal. Maybe gratefulness is a better term. And then it's non-agentic. So that would make sense in the case of that prospector saying, we're grateful to this mountain. He tended to see it as having agency, but you could say, well, no, the mountain doesn't intend or desire to provide us with a benefit, but there it is. And then propositional gratitude makes sense in that case. So I do think we can save the idea of gratitude to nature if we look at it through these different lenses of gratitude. So I think that makes sense. Okay. Now there is precedent for that. Okay. So Ursula Goodenough was a cell biologist. I think she's retired now for many years at Washington University in St. Louis. And she wrote a splendid book back in the early 90s entitled The Sacred Depths of Nature, Ursula Goodenough. And she talks about how, nature can evoke and activate very powerful religious emotions and sacred emotions. one of which is gratitude, as well as awe and joy and wonder and sense of reverence and all of those things. She says, we are moved to awe and wonder at the grandeur, the richness of natural beauty. It fills us with joy and thanksgiving. Ursula, the sacred depths of nature. Okay, so much like yesterday, I tried to draw together a coalescence and consolidation of perspectives on gratitude and identity. I'm trying to do the same thing with respect to gratitude to nature, to make a case for why gratitude to nature, first of all, makes sense. It's rational, it's logical, and then by extension, we can think about perhaps gratitude being something which might inspire us to take better care of our planet and to engage in environmentally responsible actions. Okay, so moving along further, one of the things I like to do is when I talk about gratitude practices, I go through the usual suspects, the usual list of things, right? Like gratitude lists and gratitude journals and gratitude letters and gratitude visits and all those things we talked about the last couple of days. But I worry that one of the risks of this is that we leave gratitude as a totally cognitive activity, gratitude only from the neck up. And we know that there is a bodily component to gratitude. Dr. Young mentioned that on the first day about worship and the embodiment of gratitude. Gratitude is expressed throughout, our bodily activities, not just how we think, but how we feel, how we express it toward others or toward God. So one of the things which I sometimes recommend to people when they're thinking about some new and creative ways to feel gratitude is to think about grateful places or grateful spaces that you like to go. Is there a particular place? Actually, you could put that in the chat right now. I wasn't planning to ask you this, but now I'm thinking about that. Yes, Rabbi Heschel did in fact write about that. Thank you very much for that, Gustavo. Is there a place which evokes in you a feeling of gratefulness, or you're just so thankful when you go there? Beaches, oceans, right? Hawaii, that'll do it for me, and so on. And I'm thinking, why don't we just, immerse ourselves in these environments more often? It would seem to be a very surefire way to activate gratitude without having to go through all those, appraisals and cognitions about who gave me this and what do I have to do to return that good and how much did it cost them and when should I reciprocate, right? Hey, just take in beauty, right? Gardens, mountains, so nature, and we know that nature impacts our health. I've taught health psychology here for many, many decades, and I give a couple of lectures on the healing power of nature. This is a picture. You see that? That's a beach in Maine. That's Pine Point, Maine. Somebody said yesterday they're from Maine. I hope you're on the call today. You might recognize that. Pam King knows where Scarborough, Maine is. This is Pine Point Beach, which is one of my favorite grateful places that my wife and I go to every summer. I spent 5 years in college in Maine. My sister still lives there. One of the things we like to do. That's not what it looks like now, by the way. West Quaddy Head, thank you. That's not what it looks like right now. It's a little bit colder right now. But anyway, I think I have a picture of the two of us. So here's some actually proof that we were there. It's not just, a picture I pulled off the internet. Anyway, I just feel so relaxed, calm. It's like energized but calm at the same time. Just grateful that I've had the opportunity to attend a place that I went to when I was in college, back in the late 70s, and I've continued to go there. It hasn't changed. It's still the same, 35, 40 years later. So grateful places and spaces, we know that these can activate a deep sense of thankfulness or gratefulness. Norman Wiersbe is a theologian at Duke University, and he has said a lot about gratitude in the context of nature, in the context of the environment, as a key indicator of what he calls ecological intelligence. And this is a quote from one of his chapters. I think this was entitled, "Thanks for the Dirt," why we should be grateful for the dirt, which sustains us and sustains all living organisms. And he says this: the world comes to us as a gift, as a given presence. Gratitude can be one of the most salient and powerful contexts for responsible environmental action. The knowledge and understanding we are after goes to the heart of our identity. So there's that I word again, identity. But beyond that, he says, when we are grateful, we acknowledge that what we receive is valuable and matters beyond what I may or may not be able to do with it. After all, life does not begin and end with us. The human story, in a sense, is meaningful and possible only because it arises within a dynamic evolutionary story that has an integrity of all its own. It results in the humble admission that we do not and cannot live alone, but must learn to organize our living so to be in better alignment with the living of others. So again, more and more, evidence, persuasive arguments that, you can tether together gratitude and the environment and nature, and then taking care of the environment, which would be the next step. So to answer the question, can we feel gratitude to the environment? I think so. I would posit yes, because even though we might not see agency, we might see agency. Of course, from a theistic worldview, we would see the creation as given. And so that would make sense. But even if we don't, we say yes, because there are natural systems that provide unearned and valuable benefits. As we just said, all the just the physiological and psychological benefits that nature is restorative and recuperative when we're feeling stressed or depressed, or just want to feel more grateful or connected to the earth, we go into nature. So it does make sense. I think it is logical, it is rational to feel gratitude in these contexts. So that raises the question, which is now the essence and gist of my presentation here. Everything else has been setting the stage for it. Can gratitude help to combat climate change? Okay, along with Andrew Saracen at the Templeton World Charity Foundation, we wrote an article together that was published in Time magazine, and we're going to put the link up in the chat box. So if you want to access that at some point, it's appeared last fall, right after the environmental summit in Europe last summer, or last fall. I guess it was November. Actually, I can't remember dates at all, but it was the Glasgow's where it was, right? The COP26 climate change conference. And so we decided to write this editorial about the power of, thank you, there's the link right there. What are the ways in which gratitude might be beneficial? Now, I have to, contextualize this and give the usual sorts of warnings. Now, this doesn't mean that gratitude is going to solve all the problems, right? It's not to say, well, let's just, be grateful and then the climate change is going to go away and the temperature will go down and the seas, won't continue to rise and the ice caps will melt and all those things, right? So, but we start to speculate, what ways might gratitude make a difference, and in which ways could it have an impact, given how we tend to think about the issues of climate change? A super important article that we use as a kind of a launching pad for our contention that gratitude actually matters was written now 10 years ago. It appeared in the journal Nature Climate Change. And we're also going to put this link also in the chat, an actual PDF of the paper. I think it's super important. It's not a long article. It's only about 6 pages, but the authors do a wonderful job at articulating why it is the case, okay, that the human judgment system is not well equipped to think about climate change in a morally urgent way. Typically, we don't see it as a moral imperative. Now, we know some do. We know the scientific community tends to, but a lot of people don't, right? And they articulate all the reasons why this is the case. And I have just 2 tables from this article, one of which is about the challenges posed by climate change to the human moral judgment system. So why is it so difficult to get people to engage in this and see it in a sense of urgency? And they say there's 6 reasons why. And I'm not going to go through all of those. I'll just mention a couple of them. And one of the things they point out is that, well, the ideas are just so abstract for a lot of people. They're not really local or concrete or specific. It's like way off in the future, so it's like, hey, 50 years, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, it's hard to think about that. They say also it's a lot of it's non-intuitive. Some of the findings or some of the things that you hear don't make sense logically to people, and it causes them some difficulty in ratcheting this up to a level of moral urgency. For example, Back when, before climate change was the term, remember, global warming was a term that was used a lot. But what was happening is that people were saying, oh, well, how can we have global warming when, here's all these cities that are having the coldest winter on record, and so there was this incongruity there that people didn't, the average person couldn't, make sense out of those two things. They're saying it's global warming, but it's 50 below zero, so they would just discount the concept based on that incongruity. So that's one thing. The other is the fact that this is unintentional action that's causing these difficulties, right? Nobody wants climate change to occur or is purposely trying to make it happen. It's the result of, behavior probably perceived by most people as unintentional, right, actions. And so studies suggest that unintentionally caused harms are judged less harshly than equally severe but intentionally caused ones. So again, it's part of the way the mind works. We don't intend to cause climate change, but here it is anyway. Yes, it is the consequence of our actions. And so that tends to, move it down in terms of overall moral urgency. Another one is in terms of what they call the guilty bias. When people don't want to feel guilt or bad, fear, example, when they're given messages about, how bad it is that you've done all these things, to hurt the environment, right? And so we engage in cognitive processes to minimize our, complicitness in these things. So these are just some of the reasons why it makes it very difficult to wrap our minds around the issue of climate change and why it poses a challenge to our moral judgment system. But fortunately, if we just stop there, it'd be like, throw up your hands and say, there's nothing we can do about it. They also suggest 6 things we can do, or psychological strategies that we, being, I guess, policymakers or those educators or scientists or people who have some, capacity to make a difference, that can bolster the recognition of climate change as a moral imperative. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but one of the important ones is use existing moral frameworks and moral values. So use frameworks that appeal to people, in particular groups, all right? So they give the example of efforts by religious leaders to frame climate change as a religious issue of stewardship, which can increase the salience of the subject among, audiences. Maybe you're skeptical of it, but when you phrase it in terms of that or in terms of creation care, it can resonate, with people who have beliefs that can tap into the different message framing techniques. Another one is focus. I like this one, burdens versus benefits. So studies show if you focus on the benefits for future generations, it doesn't work as well. It almost seems counterintuitive to me. I thought it would. But they have shown that compared to people who read that climate change will diminish food and clean water supplies, those who read that climate change will lead to the greater spread of infectious diseases, so increasing a burden, actually have more concern for the well-being of future generations. So if you focus on the good things future generations will get, it actually causes less concern, less urgency perhaps, than if you focus on all the things which could go wrong. Human suffering will go up if we don't do something. That's more morally urgent than saying, well, it's nice for them to have clean water and more food and that sort of thing. So focusing on burdens versus, and the last one that I just want to make, because this is where gratitude comes in, using emotional carrots, not sticks. So communicating the burdens that climate change places on present and future generations doesn't require generating feelings of guilt or shame or angst or other things, but rather, in fact, those things can backfire. They say appeal to hope, appeal to pride, appeal to gratitude instead, because these can drive support for climate change actions more generally. All right, so, and they give some evidence this is the case, that actually when people feel pride for their actions, taking care of the environment, or feel more hopeful about the future, or feel more grateful about the present, this actually drives pro-social behavior and taking care of things. As Wiersbe said in that quote, or as I mentioned the other day, that gratitude actually leads a person to engage in action which is more generous, more compassionate, more giving, more pro-social. So those are just some ideas that they have. I think it's a very important article. We highlight that in our little piece for Time magazine, and then the link I saw is in the chat, so you may want to read some of the arguments because I think they're very good and very logical, and they go in depth more so than I can do in this brief presentation. Anyway, there actually is some research on examining the role that gratitude can play in making environmentally sound decisions. And this was a study came out in the journal Emotion last year. I don't have the link for that one, but you can easily Google David DiSteno, who was the main author, second author, but he's done a lot of work on gratitude as a moral virtue. And this particular article is quite interesting because they did an experiment. This is an experimental design where they activated people's levels of gratitude by having people recall something they were grateful for, right? Think of a time where you were grateful. And then they had to engage in a behavior which had to do with taking from a pool of shrinking resources. So a typical laboratory experiment, here's a resource, here's how much you can take, and then did they take it fast? Did they take it slow? We know that people tend to hoard things when supplies are in short supply. Look at the beginning of the pandemic, right? When there was no toilet paper and there was no, pasta on the shelves and cleaning supplies and all of those things. So the deeply ingrained human tendency is to take more for yourself when supplies run low. So you get more in the short run, but then there's less for everyone else in the long run. So this was an experiment where people had a chance to extract from a collective pool points, and they could use these points and use those to win a cash prize. So there was some motivation to draw a lot of points for yourself. What they found was those participants who were led to be grateful by engaging in a grateful reflection of a grateful memory took the same number of points no matter how quickly the pool was shrinking. But those in a control condition, they grabbed more. They took more points if the pool was shrinking very quickly. So the gratitude group refrained from overdrawing resources. And they showed that feeling happy or feeling just in a positive mood didn't have the same result. So they suggest that gratitude is beneficial, that it promotes, cooperative behavior, it promotes long-term vision, and so forth, and suggests that, hey, there's potential here for gratitude to make a difference when it comes to action that is in the, in the interest of the environment. So just one example of a study which has examined that. Other people have been examining, there's actually a trait questionnaire. I'm not going to share that with you because we're getting short on time, where I just got an email from the researcher in Hong Kong who's developed a gratitude to nature questionnaire and shows that it's linked to positive decision-making when it comes to pro-environmental behavior, as well as actual donation to environmental causes. And he defines gratitude to nature as a sense of gratefulness and thankfulness toward nature that results from the recognition that one has benefited from its provisions. So again, does gratitude to nature make sense? Yes, it does. Now we know we can measure it. We can actually manipulate gratitude in the laboratory and show that actually makes a difference when it comes to behavioral decisions, that it could have long-term impacts when it comes to pro-environmental behavior. Okay, we're getting toward the end, so I do want to mention some questions for reflection. Let's think about this, okay? So I think we can make the case that gratitude in the context of nature, the environment, good decisions with respect to, beneficial environmental behaviors, pro-environmental attitudes is a good thing. Gratitude perhaps can be marshaled in the cause for that. Here are some specific questions, though. What are specific? And this is, we have these in the Time magazine article. We end with a bunch of bulleted points, just for reflection. Like an agenda for the future. I'm actually starting to work on a review paper which identifies not just gratitude, but other potential resources, spiritual qualities like awe, a sense of wonder, a sense of humility, perhaps hope even, and how these might be linked to both pro-environmental attitudes, but also environmentally responsible behaviors. Anyway, so what are specific ways in which environmental gratitude motivates, inspires, and drives behavior conducive to generating ecological action? There's got to be some specific ways, right? And some of the research suggests some specific things that have been examined so far, but again, a lot more needs to be done. How can the related emotions of awe and wonder, for example, be promoted to generate greater connection and appreciation for the natural world? Are these things that can be taught, like in schools, for example? It can be, from the beginning. So there's a real, organic basis for making these decisions, and perhaps, overcome some of those obstacles that Markowitz and Sharif mentioned in that article. And then, the tragedy of the commons, right, is when you take for yourself, but actually there winds up being less and less for people over time. What happens if you put grateful individuals within a group? I think this is particularly fascinating, right? How many individuals would it take to put in a group so you could actually reduce the tragedy of the commons? Hopefully they would have an impact on others. We know that emotions tend to be contagious, and that gratitude tends to spiral within organizations, within relationships and units, and so on. And that could be very interesting as well. So those are just a few ideas. There's a few more potential questions, potential problems, and also solutions that we suggest in the Time article. Okay, now you might be thinking, I don't want to go that just quite yet. This seems to put a lot of pressure on gratitude. I mean, doesn't it? I mean, gratitude is just such a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling. I mean, do we really want to, make it work this hard? Do we want to put that much pressure on it for gratitude to carry all the weight toward a more sustainable future and more planetary flourishing and all of those things? Are we asking too much from it? So I actually want to close by considering these words from Lisa Graham McMinn, who is a Christian psychologist. Mark McMinn is her husband, and they've been very visible in their work within, trying to apply Christian theological themes to issues related to the larger picture of, the environment, environmental stewardship, and all those sorts of things. And so she wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Sociology and Christianity. And I have a quote that I want to share with you as I wrap up my time here with you today and this week, by the way. That's been wonderful. So thank you so much for your faithfulness in attending each day. Look forward to your comments and questions in about a half hour. So she says this, answering the question, are we asking too much from gratitude? Perhaps not, she says. If what follows gratitude is a desire to pay attention, looking for God manifest in streams, in the setting moon, in the eyes of owls, and in each other. Perhaps what follows is a desire to partner actively with God in the ongoing unfolding of a world characterized by shalom. Peace because justice prevails. Peace because we inhabit a world of grace, which has been present from the beginning, and because we, along with all creation, are on a long journey that will eventually take us back into God's loving embrace, right? Beautiful words. And, we conclude our Time magazine article with this sentence, and I think it's a good way to conclude the session here today, or at least my part of it. I don't think gratitude alone is going to solve all of our problems, certainly not all of our environmental problems. It's not going to, restore biodiversity or halt sea temperature increase, but also seems to me unlikely that we can solve any significant environmental problems without gratitude. I think that is a fair statement to make. And I think, gratitude, I think any significant problem, whether it's the environment or anything else that people are saying are urgent issues right now, whether it's, inflation, immigration, racism, I think we got to bring gratitude into the conversation here, because gratitude is something we know matters. We know it's a deep touch point of human existence. And if we ignore it, if we ignore gratitude, it's to our own peril, and I don't want to be an alarmist about, about our future. And there's enough voices that do that sort of thing. But I just think that it's hard to imagine solving any significant problem without gratitude in some way, shape, or form. So I'm going to end there. I think we have Dr. Villacorta coming up next to respond. Is that right, Brad?
That's correct.
Thank you, Dr. Emmons, for the thorough and detailed presentation you have given. As I heard you speaking this morning, I caught my attention that we are living in one of the most critical moments in history. Many of the issues concerning climate change has divided societies and political movements globally. I would argue that the global crisis of our time might be a mirroring of the inner turmoil of the human condition, deteriorated by greed, war, violence, and an ever-increasing and self-interest of the powerful and their destructive power. I wonder if the deterioration of the human race relationally and morally has to do with the ways humans have treated the planet and its resources. So based on your presentation, it is critical to ask ourselves the pertinent questions to care for and express gratitude for the planet as our home and beautiful creation, God's creation given to us to bring forth life for fruitfulness. Now, why should we care or be grateful for the decay we see in the environment? Another question I have for myself is, how does your presentation instill in me the intentionality to express gratitude for what our common home provides to me? One thing I learned from the pandemic of 2 years is to pay close attention to my backyard, my house. I live in Colorado, and as you may know, the ground conditions for planting are unique. Rugged conditions, low temperatures and high temperatures make it almost impossible to grow anything edible. So having a garden never worked for me. However, I studied and applied basic gardening concepts for the past 2 years while in quarantine. As a result, I appreciate and look forward to gardening now. I planted and harvested vegetables starting early spring through mid-fall. I enjoy the generosity of a well-treated soil, adequate irrigation, and seeds. It was a lot of work, but it did not matter every time I harvested. I took many things for granted, I said to myself. Now I realize how much I lacked intentional gratitude for what people do to plant, harvest, and stock the produce in the local markets. The created order, the beautiful display of God's splendor and glory, the material world that is now decaying because of our lack of understanding, ought to move us to recognize our responsibility to what we're doing with the extension of the beauty and the glory of God in the created order. Pope Francis, in the Laudato Si, invites us to foster a new dialogue and universal solidarity. Gratitude is the first stepping stone toward a constructive conversation among people. We need to own the damage caused to our common home. While climate change continues to increase, the human race moves toward the crucible of facing unprecedented changes in our local weather systems as ever before. The consequences of our choices and immoral faculties that foment environmental degradation. There is this intrinsic power in the word and practice of gratitude, especially related to our humanity and its relationship to our common home. I was oblivious to my own lack of awareness of how many things I take for granted without the intention of being thankful for. I learned to give grace before every meal as a good Christian, but somehow, Dr. Emmons, what you presented opened my eyes to a wider reality. It knitted together what I experienced in gardening and what I learned from your presentation. Now, I have a better language to start in conversations with others about our common disregard and unawareness of the problems within each of us. These problems lead us to neglect and minimize the global crisis. First, I would like to start backwards in my response to your paper and reflect on the words of Lisa Graham McMinn. She asked several questions that are to be answered by those who will take this seriously. And I quote, that gratitude is a higher way to pay attention to looking for God, manifest in the waters, in the setting of the moon, in the eyes of the owls, and in each other, end of quote. Second, this is a calling of serious consideration to God's creative hand in all there is in front of us. Instead of moving in understanding who we are as human beings, as male and females, in the interplay of our relationships with one another, we have regressed. We have treated the other as objects, as something for one's self-interest, something that one wants to exploit. The basics of human selfishness materializes in the economies of consumption and greed. And this is what is destroying us. If we relate destructively with other human beings, what could we expect in one's relationship with nature? Third, the sense of entitlement, the lie that entices us to believe that we deserve everything for a selfish desire, must be addressed. So in the words of Lisa Graham McMinn, we ought to envision our world redeemed and characterized by shalom. Gratitude must be the foundation for the mutual and vulnerable exchange of giving and receiving. God's shalom will be tangibly seen in the flourishing of creation and its inhabitants. Divine justice prevails and invites us to participate in healing and brings us to our senses to respond to the beauty and the redemption of the created order. Interestingly, we are having a conference on the science of gratitude and how crucial it is for us today to confess and realize that we are endangering the next generations and ourselves by our choices. If we prefer the opposite, the selfish entitlement and greed, these will ensure humanity's undoing. When we think that we deserve to be on this planet only to exploit and rape its natural resources, we go against the divine intention of stewardship and caring for the earth and its resources. The human race lives in denial, pretending that we can do whatever we want with the natural resources without taking any responsibility. With destructive power, we only dispose of our common home in the name of progress and prosperity. We must realize that we're not well equipped to recognize the problem of climate change. So far, in our attempts, we try to impose, even in doing something good, we oppress the other by our nagging what we need to talk about in climate change conversations. So far, it has not been effective. This is a heart's problem. Our consciousness need an awakening to the realization that the expression of our inner turmoil as human beings, male and female, may be reflected in nature. Seeing nature's chaos and destructive forces sure reminds us that we are inevitably interconnected. And this should steer us into an awareness and that will help us change our attitude toward gratefulness. It should bring us to our common sense in us of being vulnerable to beauty, vulnerable to the resources that refreshes our soul, nurture our bodies, and how we can give back in reciprocity. Therefore, the appeal for emotional and intrinsic motivators will help us perhaps to take care and regain consciousness by admitting our lack of understanding, a lack of emotional response to what we are doing to ourselves. In the words of Pope Francis mentioned, in the vision of Francis of Assisi, highlights that love and respect for life should invite us to take responsibility and in our devotion and worship to God, to give space in our lives to the act of gratitude in a reciprocal way. A grateful heart shows love and respect for what is given. It is an Eucharistic moment rooted in the core act of human redemption. You know, the Gospels show gratitude for the fruit of the earth symbolized in the bread and the wine. To express thank you as an expression of a grateful heart to God is the ongoing invitation live out in the Lord's Supper and given to us, God's people, as an act of remembering. Dr. Emmons helped us to understand the healing power of reciprocity, which will nurture our spirituality and will lead us to a flourishing life crafted in the words of gratitude, benevolence, and respect for the beauty and the creative hand of God. The sense of entitlement in the heart of human beings like myself inhabits in generations, cultures, religions, because these only lead us to the destruction and rape of nature. So the underlying definition of gratitude is to invite us to regain, to redeem our way of being grounded and embedded in seeing life as a gift. Perhaps such disposition of a heart will lead us to a conversation with people that not necessarily hold faith in God, but invite us to mutuality. It creates bridges of opportunities for conversations about caring for the planet, Mother Earth. Remember, and I want to go back to my illustration of the garden. It was a reciprocal moment for me that allowed me to realize how much I lack gratitude toward the good of the earth given to me. So listening to Dr. Emmons again helped me connect how something as simple as my vegetable garden, giving forth its bounty as I care for the soil, producing me an unexpected sense of gratitude. It changed me. It motivated me to have conversations with others about giving and receiving in the liturgy of gardening. This last point leads me to think about the innate reciprocity in the practice of people of different cultures around the world. This is a substantive indicator of human interconnectedness through gratitude. The promise of the science of gratitude, as shared in your presentation here in the GTN, the Gratitude to Nature Scale, invites us to become morally concerned with the needs of the world, the earth, and intrinsically motivated to act responsibly toward creation and its environment. And to conclude, I want you to, for a minute, my friends, to picture yourself in front of a beautiful Thanksgiving table. And you are gathered there with your family. You can smell the aroma of freshly baked apple pie, my favorite, coming in front of you, and the scent of the spices of a cooked turkey. Yet deep in your heart, there's an increasing desire to give thanks and get on the food. So let's take this act of gratitude deep in our hearts today to naturally instill in us a sense of love, care, and respect for our common home. Acts that can be translated into thankfulness for the produce of the earth, for clean water, for the hands of those who farm the fields and those who harvest so that we can eat and nourish our bodies. May the act of gratitude from our hearts deliver us from our greed, from our sense of entitlement that only destroy the human soul into the unending cycle of selfishness, self-interest, and self-sufficiency. Let gratitude be a virtue to redeem us from the entitlement lie that we have embraced as a society, as cultures around the globe. May we be thankful in response to the benefits that we receive from nature and appropriate the invitation to value our role in this moment in history, that we are trustees and caretakers of our common home, in the words of Pope Francis. Failure to preserve and protect the gifts that none of us have worked for, but have been given to us as gifts, may be a practice we can take away from this presentation, this conference, to call ourselves stewards, built and embedded in the spirit of gratefulness. Let us be aware that reciprocity attunes our hearts and respond to the countless ways in which our planet supports, sustains, and nourishes and provides to everyone, to all of us. The ultimate goal is that we can flourish along with our common home for the glory of God. Gratitude to nature invites us to embrace perhaps a sociology of emotions that will move us to energize our lives together to not only care for what's important to one person or to one society or to one government, but to help us to acknowledge and to take ownership that we are interconnected with one another and with our common home. Our common sustainability for generations, for our families, for our children and grandchildren shall invite us to recollect how critical and important it is to acknowledge in the prayer of Francis of Assisi in the following. And join me in this prayer. Praise be you, my Lord, through brother wind and air, and fair, stormy, all-weather moods by which you cherish all that you have made. Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustain us and govern us, producing varied fruit with colored flowers and herbs. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister water, so useful, so humble, so precious, so pure. So in addition, let me finish with this. Thank you, Lord, for this beautiful home that you remind us again that is for us to care, respect, cherish, and love, and to be grateful for. Amen.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries." Notice where you are as we begin this response to the lecture on gratitude and climate change. Perhaps notice the chair holding you, the floor holding the chair, the earth holding the floor. Notice anything growing around you, plants, trees, pets, people. Take a deep breath in. Let that breath go. Allow yourself to be fully in the environment where you are, connected with your mind to the words I'm about to share, but also connected in your body and your spirit. Bring your holistic attention to the place you are. In a time where technology allows us to constantly connect, we can also experience disconnection from one another, our world, and even our bodies, as life is lived through screens. For now, I encourage you to be present with yourself and with me, even as we are in different geographical locations. My name is Bethany Ferguson, and I am a fourth-year PhD student in the Fuller School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy. I'm originally from the American South. I'm the oldest daughter of a Presbyterian minister and an English teacher. So perhaps with a background in religion and stories and poetry, I was always destined to move into psychology. As I begin my response to today's lecture, it's important for me to state that I've been shaped by my faith tradition, my family background, and my cultural environment. Also of note, before I came to Fuller, I spent over a decade living outside of the United States, working in counseling, education, and faith-based community development in Uganda, South Sudan, and Kenya. These experiences grew my psychological research interests and my desire to work in psychotherapy and assessment, and ultimately brought me to be a part of the Headington Research Lab, where I focused my research on trauma, spirituality, and culture. My practice of intentional gratitude began when I lived in South Sudan. It was a place where I was welcomed with grace into a new community and found the joy of building cross-cultural connections and relationships. I found meaningful work in education and counseling, and was inspired by the resilience, tenacity, and humor of those I worked with. It was also a place of ongoing political conflict and resource insecurity, and it was often very dry and very hot. During my time living there, South Sudan had one of the highest infant and maternal mortality rates in the world, and many people lived on less than $1 a day. In the face of so much challenge, I found myself struggling with discouragement and anxiety, and so my colleagues and I began a communal gratitude list. Each month, we would draw or write what we were grateful for on a large piece of paper displayed in a common room. The practice of gratefulness brought hope and motivation for endurance in a challenging situation. However, hidden behind the practice of gratitude was the reality of grief, loss, and injustice. We cultivated gratitude because in the face of so much difficulty, we sometimes forgot to express our gratitude. But we did not lose awareness of the pain and injustice all around us. When we consider the world and our place in it, there's always a tension. There's beauty and awe. There's grief and loss. I was recently on a hike in the San Gabriel Mountains near my house, just as the sun was setting. I found myself exclaiming again and again on the beauty of the hike and how privileged I felt to be there. But at the same time, there was evidence of erosion and landslides from the many hikers, just like me, who had gratefully climbed the mountain, and in so doing, had eroded the beauty. We always hold a tension of gratitude, of beauty for the world, and grief for a world where there's always loss and destruction. And often humans are the cause of this loss and destruction. We know the ways we interact with our environment impact us and the environment. Every day, we are confronted with a myriad of small and large decisions. Plastic bags or reusable bags, purchasing pre-packaged food items, flying on planes, setting the thermostat in our houses. Dr. Emmons has argued that, quote, gratitude is vital for individual and collective flourishing, and the capacity for human flourishing is surely limited under the extremes of climate change, end quote. There's a tension between individual momentary flourishing and broader, more nuanced understandings of flourishing. For example, I lived internationally for many years without indoor plumbing. Thus, I am grateful daily for access to a hot shower or an indoor toilet. I also lived for years in places where people did not have access to clean water, and I'm cognizant of the ways water usage in the United States may strain the environment and increase the likelihood of water shortages. Thus, as long as we live in a world where, according to a 2019 report by the World Health Organization, 785 million people do not have access to basic water services, clean water is an issue of concern for us all. Toilet flushing alone accounts for 30% of household water usage. How does my gratefulness for the current privilege of access to indoor plumbing intersect with my grief that 785 million people do not have access to water services, and concern that ongoing overuse of water resources may impact water access in the future? What will empower us to navigate the complexities of our current environmental challenges? I would add that, adding to Dr. Emmons' foundation of gratefulness, we must bring a humble awareness of our interconnectedness. Dr. Martin Luther King, in a sermon in 1967, stated, "Now, let me suggest first that if we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. We must develop a world perspective. No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone. And as long as we try, the more we are going to have war in this world. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality." Until I see that my thriving is connected to the thriving of those around me and the thriving of the world, I will have difficulty engaging for environmental change that will not seem to directly benefit my individual thriving. As Dr. Emmons mentioned, we must consider not only individual, but also collective flourishing. This involves humility. Carrie Danner, in her article entitled "Hope, Courage, and Resistance During Climate Change: Insights from African American Economic Cooperative Practices," states this: "This decentering aspect of humility awakens us to our interdependence on others." For example, during my time working in South Sudan, most of my Sudanese colleagues were involved in agriculture in some way. Given lack of regulation in Sudan, potentially harmful pesticides were available. I spoke with a friend about the potential long-term risks of pesticides. He looked at me with some suspicion and stated that the United States had used these pesticides to get rich and grow food, and now I wanted him not to be able to have the same access to food. Here, I became aware of how food practices and wealth accumulation in my home country impacted environmental decision-making in a small South Sudanese village a world away from my passport country. Danner goes on to state, "Those at the margins have more immediate, or perhaps just conscious experience of institutions and systems outside of their control. For many privileged people today, the magnitude of uncertainty and the degree with which they are confronted by it is new, however. The likelihood of water shortages, displaced populations, and toxic oceans is unsettling. All members of society are now enmeshed in a web of environmentally destructive resource extraction, production, distribution, and disposal of goods. We are often unsure which actions will produce the best results. Fundamentally, an accurate understanding of self in context reveals the limits of individual power. Humility helps correct the moral vision of both the privileged and the marginalized, and points to the strength, even the necessity, of communal responses." That's the end of Danner's quote. Perhaps then, embodiment and familial connections are helpful ways to humbly consider our interconnectedness, thus creating space both for grief and gratitude. Sally McFaig, in her book, The Body of God, an Ecological Theology, states, "Creation as the place of salvation means that the health and well-being of all creatures and parts of creation is what salvation is all about. It is God's place and our place, the one and only place." Craig Santos Perez, in his ecological poem Rings of Fire, compares his daughter's spiking fever to the fires of California and the rising temperatures of South Sudan, noting fires and drought to be symptoms of an earth that is not fully healthy. His poetry directs us to bring the same concern and care towards the earth that we would bring to an unhealthy daughter or loved one, and to also consider how art and poetry can propel environmental activism. Every planting season in South Sudan, my small Episcopal church in Okari would gather to bless the seeds. We would engage in prayers, songs, dances, and a meal together to acknowledge the mystery of an earth shaped by God and cultivated by people that we depend on for food for another season of life. We would share seeds with one another, make plans to plant together, and anticipate how communal cultivation could lead to communal celebration and flourishing. Danner states, at the explicitly religious level, uncertainty is part of the burden of Christian discipleship. While Christians proclaim to know how the story ends in resurrection, we do not know the path before us. We need to be humble enough to risk practices that may or may not solve the crisis, but still somehow embody God's presence with us as wayfarers. We not only share the path, but must learn from and even change our path in light of new insights. End of the quote. On this journey towards climate change, gratitude must be joined by acknowledged humility and interconnectedness in order to cultivate a world of healing and flourishing. Thank you so much for your attention today and the opportunity to respond to this talk.
Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Emmons, Dr. Villacorta, and Bethany Ferguson. We're going to begin a Q&A time together. Unfortunately, Bethany couldn't be with us live today. She is out there in the world helping people as a clinical practitioner. So she had that responsibility, but we're glad that she was able to record that response for us. I want to remind you again to put questions in the Q&A function there and upvote the ones you'd like to see answered, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Let me begin, Bob, with you. Anything you'd like to respond to from Wilmer or Bethany's responses?
Well, I want to upvote Dr. Villacorta to respond to all the questions that come up, because I can't imagine a more persuasive or compelling or articulate response to anything I said. So that was amazing. Thank you for that. And just judging by the reactions I was seeing in the chat, I'm not alone in that opinion. So very, very powerful.
Well,
thank you for that.
Thank you, Bob, for such a thorough. I never realized how much I lacked gratitude for what I eat every day. And so it was just very refreshing to be able to connect a spiritual practice as gardening, but I was doing it just for the sake of the experience of being spiritual without any embodiment into the experience of feeling the dirt in your hands. And like somebody was saying in the chat, there's a connection with nature that enriches us and renews us. And that was a discovery for me.
You think we learn something about ourselves when we put our hands in the dirt,
Exactly.
don't you? I mean, when you think about even just etymologically, when you think about the word for ground, humus, right? And humility and humans, there's a connection that goes beyond just the link, in language.
So true. And I think that for me as an academic and a person of words and always talking, feeling the dirt, feeling the mess of water and soil and seeds and the frustration of not seeing them as fast, it was a realization how much entitlement also I had.
Yes.
So that really helped me to deliver myself of that problem, I would say.
Yeah, I had a friend who would plant a garden, but he didn't have the patience for the things to actually grow, the vegetables. So he would see the carrot tops coming out, then he'd pull it out to see how it was doing. And then, of course, it didn't work so well after that. But yeah, don't you think we've kind of lost connection with the natural world, right? I mean, we're so divorced from where the source of food comes from. I mean, we've learned a lot more since the pandemic about, supply chains and all of those things.
Right.
But, we don't grow our own food. We don't sustain ourselves. I mean, a few people do, but not too many. The food comes from the supermarket, right? It doesn't come from the ground. And I think that's what, maybe you're saying. It's harder for us to recognize our debts of gratitude when we don't know where stuff comes from, right? And I don't know how we get that back. I guess you can encourage people to grow gardens, and maybe these community gardens and farmers markets and all of those things can help, right?
Exactly.
One thing that occurred to me just a second, well, it occurred to me when I was listening to Bethany. She began with kind of a very short grounding exercise, right?
Yes,
Feel yourself in the chair,
Right.
feel it. And I was immediately flooded with sensation and feeling and
right.
this sense again of, I wonder how being connected to the earth as body is also connected to ourselves as bodies. And Wilmer, you just mentioned that, as academics, we live in our heads. We live
Right.
sort of disembodied lives. And can I get the two of you to vamp on that at all? Is there some connection you think between recognizing our own embeddedness, embodiedness in some ways, and the earth and gratitude?
I think it takes a level of vulnerability to even recognize our need. And I live in my head 24/7. And that for me was an exercise, but it had to be in a place where in quarantine, you couldn't do much, but doing things around the house. So that led me for me to realize how vulnerable I was to a reality that we all experiencing. But it was just the fact that I had to go and start something that I never tried and give up on, because it was so frustrating not to see anything grow. But in that act made me realize how vulnerable I was to my own sense of entitlement that, it inhibited my ability to say, thank you, Lord, for all the good things that we can have, even in a pandemic. But so I was, in many ways, I felt totally disconnected with the reality of how much it takes to grow something. So that rooted me into that groundness of creation. I'm part of this thing. So when I read Bob's paper, I thought, wow, I missed so much in so many years that now it's part of this connectedness of my soul to something I never explored before as a professor living in my head 24/7.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can do a better job at forging connections between our minds and our bodies and our biological habitats. And I mean, we can all do a little part using whatever influence we have. I mean, I tried to do that in 35 years of teaching when I taught health psychology. And I would, explicitly, as I mentioned in my talk today, draw attention to nature and how it benefits, humans, the restorative, recuperative, from those classic studies of patients in hospitals who looked out at, flowers and trees versus those who looked at the parking structure or a brick wall, right? They healed more quickly. They require less pain-killing medication. They were less a problem, to the hospital staff and all of those things. And we know that people say, well, the location they go when they're feeling stressed or depressed is in nature, is the beach, is the ocean. It's the sort of things that people put in the chat when I ask them. So, we need to keep that in mind of that. What's the term that the biologist came up with? Biophilia, love of living things, right? Love of nature, right? Just so powerful, built into who we are. And if we can take advantage of that, we can start to, open the door, maybe nudge us in that direction, not just having those nice, warm, fuzzy feelings, but actually doing something with those feelings, right? Which is the whole point of, can we move the needle a bit in terms of making better choices long term if we can activate these emotions, whether it's gratitude, whether it's awe, whether it's wonder, whether it's humility, or the entire package. I think that's the key. But yeah, having a garden. I mean, I grew up and my grandfather we lived 2 houses away, and I spent every day, every summer just in his garden, right? Growing, planting, seeing things grow. And I still, to this day, I can smell a tomato plant in my backyard, and it transports me back to then, 60 years, 50 years ago. I'm not that quite that old, 45, 50 years ago, right? And to be able to, have that foundation and be able to give that to my own kids, as we tried to do when they were growing up. And then we would travel through my hometown and we would actually sell the vegetables, driving through neighborhoods. And it's just so cool to have those memories now. So I think that's really, really important that we can, you see movements of trying to restore that, trying to regain that sense of dependency, on the ground and growing. And if we can do that in a more, I think, concentrated way through education, right, through other means, I think that's a step in the right direction.
Right. It's wonderful. Well, let me get to some of these questions here. There's a question that's been voted up about the way in which climate change has been a source of division within evangelical communities. And the question is, do you have any suggestions for how to engage in a conversation around gratitude for our planet without triggering further division?
Yeah, I mean, we know that's the case, right? That certain groups or ideologies tend to adopt certain issues as theirs, and that makes everyone else, opposed to it, who disagrees. So yesterday I saw the survey that came out. I think it was from the Quinnipiac poll about what people see as the most urgent issues right now, right? And so the independents and conservatives, for them, the important issues are inflation, right? The economy, crime, and immigration. And then climate change, was fifth or sixth, or maybe it wasn't even that high. For the liberals, it was climate change was up there, right? Pandemic was off the chart for each group. We've moved on from that, even though we're still online. But people don't see that as urgent anymore compared to immigration, compared to crime, compared to inflation, and then climate change. But the hierarchy of the importance look very different in those two groups. And that's the way it's been, with climate change, from the beginning. It has been a very, polarizing political issue. So, and I don't know if that is bridgeable or not. I think that article by Sharif and his co-author, I think it offers some suggestions, and I can't remember everything they said, but they said, if you can find the moral issue that matters to people, no matter what their ideology is, okay, and lean into that, right? That's going to be most critical. So is it, the well-being of future generations? Is it about, seeing oneself as a steward of God's creation, for a person who is, of a Christian theological sensibility? I think if you find that hot button issue or that thing that matters the most to that individual or to that group of individuals, then you can, I think, mobilize some commonality there, as opposed to saying, well, we're all live in the same world, we're all interdependent, and all those things are true. But for all the reasons they give in this article, that just doesn't create enough urgency for people, right? It doesn't really, they can't identify with that in a sense of how does that affect my day-to-day behavior.
I was struck by, I think yesterday you put at one of your slides in all languages about the word thanks.
Yes.
And as I reflected on your paper and reflected on the lack of grounding in our faith, that even we celebrate the Lord's Supper. I think one common thread for conversation for people of other traditions or positions about this topic is to center ourselves in the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. And the word Eucharist in Greek means given thanks, Eucharisteo. Now, the idea, that would be a common theme that I would talk with anyone across the board and say, when we break the bread and drink the wine, we are being invited to go to the earth, to the fruit that has been, in many ways, put in this context of powerful redemption act of God in the Eucharist. And I don't think there will be even Catholics or Protestants or neo-evangelicals, whoever believes in this grounding of the Lord's Supper or communion, whatever they call it, could be a common theme in which we can give thanks for the earth, for the fruit of the wine and wheat that feeds us, but at the same time, it connects us with one another.
Yes.
Into giving thanks to God for the beautiful nation, earth that we have, in the same time engaging in conversations and what we're doing to care for it. And if we can translate somehow this Thanksgiving or Eucharist event in our life, in the spiritual life or consciousness, to become and to come to the ground, to the earth, and say, this is God's first language. As Francis of Assisi believed that creation was the first Bible for Christians who couldn't read in the medieval times. where exploitation and education was lacking everywhere, people could just contemplate God's beauty. And that was, I think, Francis of Assisi is also the patron of ecology. I think conversations around that topic, because I believe there are people of non-faith that believe and really admire Francis of Assisi for the work he's done in bringing awareness to the world.
Yeah, I mean, when I partake of the Lord's Supper, I can't help but being just in awe of how many other people at the same time are doing this around the world.
Right.
I mean, if you can even wrap your mind around the fact there's roughly 2 billion Christians, right, and who are at some point weekly, monthly, daily, whatever, re-experiencing Jesus this way, and from the beginning of time for 2,000 years doing that, you realize you're not alone, right? This is something that really is deep and profound and connects us all. Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you brought up there. Just finding that connection, the source, and you think of Thanksgiving customs and rituals around the world, whether you're religious or not. There's so many nations and countries and cultures which celebrate food and harvest one way or another, and how that is a really, I think, a good foundational point for moving forward. Just thinking about gratefulness and responsibility that we have toward each other and toward the future generations.
Well, and Wilmer, I think that's, again, beautiful. It comes back to some things we've talked about the last 2 days about how do you create meaning, and how do you create a narrative within a community. That the Eucharist is one of those rituals, practices that, depending how we narrate it, may communicate this. Let me get to another question here. This is a question, Bob. You've mentioned identity quite a bit. What theoretical approaches do you favor for understanding how beliefs become incorporated into identity, or value-based goals that motivate action?
Mm-hmm. So I think to create sustainable gratitude as a part of one's identity, it has to be based in something which transcends circumstances, vicissitudes, ups and downs of life. I don't know if this is going to make sense in the context of that question, but I think this is the best way that I can come up with it at the moment. When you think about gratefulness as a disposition, as a way of life, okay, and I think about the difference between gratitude as a temporary feeling and gratefulness as a more fundamental life orientation. I think those are two very different things. And I haven't made enough of that distinction over these past 3 days. It's one of those things which is in that book that I mentioned by Christy Nelson there. She really focused on gratefulness, living gratefully, despite the fact that you may not feel gratitude at the time. And I think that's just so important, thinking about issues of suffering and meaning, and the extraction of good out of bad, the redemptive twist that takes place when something bad can turn into something good. If you see it through a lens of gratefulness, you say, okay, what's the opportunity in the situation, right? What is the situation presenting me with that potentially I can feel gratitude as a feeling, even though there's nothing to be grateful about in the moment. So if I have that as a deeper life orientation, that helps me, deal with the suffering, deal with the trials and tribulations and all the bad things that I'm going through. But I need a worldview which is strong enough to sustain that the shoulders are broad enough, to handle that. I mean, and for me, it's God's love, right? For me, and I was asked to preach once at Westmont to all the students, right? So I mentioned yesterday, I get asked to preach once in a while. So actually, it's like 3 times in my life. It hasn't been that many, but one of those was to Westmont students, and all 1,200 students. And what I left them with, I said, okay, this is the only time I'm going to talk to you, so this is my big chance, right? I share with them my favorite scripture, which was Romans 8:38-39, right? Nothing's going to separate us from the love of God, right? Which is in Christ Jesus. Nothing, the scripture, right? I said, if I hold on to that truth, that there's nothing I can do to lose God's love, because there's nothing I could do to earn God's love in the first place. It's quite independent about me, right? It's quite, one way, right? It's not based on anything I've done. And so if I remember that, if I ground my gratitude in that becomes part of my identity. That becomes part of who I am. I am, what Christ has done for me. Right? I am what God has done for me, the person of Christ. That sustains me. That gives me reason for gratitude. That gives me reason for my gratitude, informing other decisions I make, whether it's about the environment, or about how I raise my kids, or about how I teach my classes, or what I choose to do, in my neighborhood or my town. I have a foundation that hopefully, is enough to withstand vicissitudes of life, no matter what life is throwing at us.
That's great. That's great. I want to just follow something up there a little for a second before I go to another question. And again, I'm struck with how easy it is for us to talk about gratitude in very individualistic ways. Gratitude for me, or my gratitude. But I'm wondering about gratitude for a community, or gratitude of a community. That maybe we practice gratitude for the good of the community. Maybe the community practices gratitude in such a way that sustains individuals when they can't practice gratitude. I'm wondering, what that might have to say about collectivist cultures. I'm also wondering what that has to say again about the body of Christ. You have thoughts on that, either of you?
I've been thinking about what you said, that the word Ubuntu in South African, and it's used in South Africa as a way to, which means I am because we are. So there's this sense of connection between a person and a community. And this is so foreign to us as North American Westerners, that we live in the individualistic view of our relationships, our spirituality, our practice. That I think personally, I've been instructed and educated by my African students coming to our degree programs, where they invite us to go beyond just having small groups and talk into a life of community in which we exchange stories of joy, sorrow, victory, and defeat. And that creates a sense of a community that I've never seen. I mean, I've seen it in the classroom with students around, especially our students that come with this sense of collective consciousness, that we can talk about our suffering, we can talk about our vulnerabilities, and we can open about each other stories in the service of God in the kingdom. So those are ideas that come to me when I think about how we have secluded, I would say, our ability to connect with others. And this is what reading Bob's paper on the many cultures that are really celebrating gratitude to the creation by its goods and provisions, that I realized this is the way we're connected with other humans, that are able to realize that they're not living in the same context that we are in North America, but they are connected with this sense of, wow, we need to give back in thanks to the earth, to what we are consuming from. And so I think that would be something that we need as people in the West, to invite others from different cultures and to help us to divest ourselves from our individualism that is consuming us.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of examples from my own life. So I think it was around 2008, the city of Burbank, not too far from you, Brad, and your colleagues. The city of Burbank they had a year-long program they developed, a year-long campaign. They wanted to become the most grateful city in America. Oh, that's kind of cool, right? So that takes certainly out of the individual context. So they were doing things. They were like coming up with the world's longest gratitude list. So they had these big, huge rolls of paper. They were going through the sidewalks, and everyone was writing what they were grateful for. That was just one thing. They had, activities and events, planned throughout the town. I came down and gave a talk. They had an author who had done interviewed some Hollywood people about what they're grateful for, and he had just published a book. So that was a big deal. And so that they got everyone focused, as much as possible, at least on the topic of gratitude for that entire year. So now, did that move the needle for it? Probably did in some respects, and I'm sure it was transformative for a lot of people in that particular community. So that was very cool. And then at UC Davis, we have an annual community book project so there's a committee every year that gets together and reviews various books that have been nominated for the entire, basically it's designed for the entire community to read this book and to come together, to have discussions, to have courses, seminars, workshops, speakers. The author of the book comes in once a year, the big event at the Mondavi Performing Arts Center. A few years ago, I was able to get on the committee, and the book that we chose was The Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I thought, well, first of all, I mean, a lot of us wanted that book, but we had to work hard at it because everyone had their own interest. But I thought, The Book of Joy, how great would that be for community building, right? Given that, you're familiar with that book, it's all about, connection, right? Compassion, generosity, forgiveness, gratitude, of course, figures in there as well. But I thought, that's what we need, because college campuses, there's separation, right? There's not a sense of unity in your average community, right? In your average university. Okay, I mean, we're all professors. We have our own individual, lives and empires and research units and that sort of thing. And there's not a lot of coming together and a lot of sharing. And so I thought this would be a great thing, and it's good for the mental health of students, which we know is, a big problem all around the country and around the world, for that matter. And so that was a beautiful thing to see. So that certainly got it, above and beyond the individual level, at least for that year. So those sorts of things, I think, can work and can be very powerful and make a difference.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Let me shift here a little bit to a question. Begins with thank you, wonderful presentation. When you spoke about gratitude helping with a lot of world issues such as racism, I'm wondering if you could expand on this. More specifically, do you think this is a reciprocal relationship of gratitude? Where should the oppressed or victims of racism or systemic racism find gratitude in their circumstances? How can they be grateful to or for their oppressors? It's a tough question.
Yes, it is. So thanks for that. A good way to wrap up the week, right? So I don't think you are grateful for oppression. I mean, as I mentioned the other day, that when you're grateful in all circumstances is very different than grateful for those circumstances. There's certain things we're not going to be grateful for. The question for me, sitting here very comfortably in my office day after day and so forth, is, well, it's easy to say, can we find opportunities or possibilities in these situations, no matter how painful and how unwanted they are? And where does the power of gratitude shine a light? Is it, I mean, as I said, I don't think it's just a switch we turn on when life is going well. It's also a light that can shine in the darkness. So can we find support? Can we find hope? Can we find possibilities? I think, someone like Alexis Abernathy can speak much more persuasively and compellingly, and from a point of view, both personally and professionally, and what she's examined, and what people have gone through, and gratitude has helped in the healing response in those settings, in those contexts and so forth. But, I do think that, to say that gratitude has no bearing in situations like this, I don't think that is correct either. But obviously one is not going to be grateful for these very difficult and oftentimes desperate situations. We do know that there's a mixture of life that, people feel conflicting emotions all the time, even outside these, extreme contexts, that when a person has helped and harmed me and I've suffered, but also they've benefited me, how does that play out, psychodynamically? I think that's a very fascinating issue that I don't think has fully, been appreciated in the work on gratitude, and certainly some of the clinical work, which is just really starting on gratitude, in the therapy room. How does it, hook up with things like forgiveness and accountability and, justice? And I think these are very, very important issues that, will require a lot more work from more than just psychologists with their questionnaires and interview techniques, to looking at a much broader societal level. Mm-hmm. But I do think gratitude is something which is available to everyone. And I think that's part of the beauty for me, is that you're never too young, too old, too rich, too poor, too healthy, too sick, too whatever, to experience gratitude. And to say that people can't have gratitude, even though they've been through difficult times, really is dismissive of them, really underestimates what they're capable of. And that's one one of the big lessons I've learned from my own studies of gratitude is that people have been through terrible situations. They've been, victims of abuse. They've had addictions and afflictions of various sorts. I hear from prison inmates who write to me and say they found healing in gratitude. And that inspires me to keep going forward with this work and find people like that. How do they do? And how can we learn from them? How can they be role models? Is why I continue to do what I do. So thank you for that good question, which I didn't answer, but it inspired me to have some of these thoughts.
Wilmer, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, it's a tough one. Again, I go back to the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. In an act of humility and transparency, vulnerability, Jesus broke the bread and gave thanks. That act for me is kind of the moment where nothing that I have experienced in suffering is compared to anything that has been done in slavery in this country, especially in this country, that can minimize. But I believe personally, what I've read and understood, the slave humans were able to experience the presence of God even in their bondage, recalling, and once they were able to grasp the illustrations of the scriptures, that there was power in their suffering, and someday they will be free. I think I cannot conceive their response to that act of faith without gratitude, even though it's easy for us people now in the 21st century, people that have not had that experience in their generations to say thank you. But I feel that racism is the distortion of power to its lowest, in which deprives people from freedom to live and to breathe and to touch the earth without the punishment of work that they send. So I go back to the Eucharist, the act of God in Christ, who broke the bread and gave thanks, that he was facing the hard moment in life to face the cross. And I think that should give us hope, that in gratitude we can find power to overcome our fears, our own wounds, and to look at the one who gave up everything and who gave thanks for what was coming for him. So I think there's more to unpack there. So, but I hope that this helps us to reconcile our sense of entitlement, even about what we eat, what we touch with our hands every day, and how we can have new venues, new avenues for conversation about this topic of gratitude. So it's been really enriching for me.
Thank you. Well, we're at the end, and I want to thank you, Dr. Emmons, and you, Dr. Villacorta, and earlier who heard from Bethany Ferguson. But Bob, I just want to give you a last chance to say anything before I make my final announcements. Any last words for us?
This has been an amazing 3 days, and I have to say that. So years ago, over 20 years ago, I was given a task. I was given a charge by Sir John Templeton, who is the sponsor of pretty much all the research at the Templeton Foundations in the science and practice of gratitude. And he said to me at a conference, Dr. Emmons, how can we get 7 billion people around the world to practice gratitude? I mean, he thought it was that important. Actually, 6 billion was the population at the time. Now it's 7 billion, And so he believed it was that important to human flourishing and to the future of humanity. And I'm only one person. I can only do so much. I'm glad so many other people have come alongside now from the sciences, from philosophy, from theology, from pastoral work, and continue to, maybe at some point, we can get pretty close to that 7 billion. And if we don't, we'll certainly do our best because, we need more of it, obviously, for all the reasons why we discussed over these last 3 days. So thanks for having me on and the chance to just, share some of what I've learned about this amazing concept.
Yeah, so we are very grateful to you, and thank you for the work you've done and for the way you've invited other scientists and researchers and theologians and philosophers to keep thinking about all these things. So All of those of you listening out there, keep up this good work and be grateful in your various contexts. I want to just make a few announcements before we end today, and that is we're excited to invite you to next year's 2023 Integration Symposium. The dates will be February 15th through the 17th. You can visit our event website to stay informed, to sign up. You can go to fuller.edu/symposium. We do not have our speaker or speakers chosen just yet, but we are leaning into a theme of integration and cultural diversity. So I'm very excited about that. Remember, if you're receiving CE units, a post-event survey will be sent out to all of you later today. The required evaluation forms for each day will be available to download on the last page of the survey, along with the instructions on how to submit those. For those of you who've registered for the virtual alumni gathering happening soon at 12:15 Pacific time, you should have already received a Zoom link for that. If you have any questions, please contact alumni@thefullerfoundation.org. Again, also want to express once more my gratitude and appreciation to Dr. Robert Emmons and all of our respondents for taking part in this year's symposium. If you've missed some of the symposium or you're wanting to rewatch any part of it, all of the content will be available on YouTube for viewing at your leisure. Look out for an email from Eventbrite to access those links. And in addition, Fuller Studio is pleased to offer a selection of the recordings to be released later in the months following the event. You'll find those also on the Fuller integration page. Stay tuned for any updates. And as always, feel free to visit Fuller Studio .fuller.edu, and we look forward to seeing you all next year. Thanks again for being part of this amazing 3 days.